But we have an hour allotted for the program, and the speakers will take probably about a half hour at that time. So we'll have lots of time for questions and answers. So thank you all for coming, and we'll turn it over to our moderator, Steve Carrion.
So thank you. My name is Steve Carrion. I'm a professor of English at MU and the president of the MU chapter for the American Association of University Professors, a group that is active in trying to defend academic freedom. So I want to thank the League of Women Voters, the Columbia Public Library, everybody who was responsible for this event, of course, all of you for showing up here and online. We're here today to hear about recent reductions in federal funding for universities and the effects not just on research, but also on broader impacts, especially here in our region. I want to say at the outset that all of us are employees at universities, but in our remarks today, certainly unless you hear otherwise, you should treat everyone as speaking on their own behalf, not on behalf of their employer. All right, so I will turn it over to our first, each person will introduce themselves. We'll give about 5 minutes, and then once they're all done, then we'll move into the question and answer. So please go ahead.
Hi, I'm Sean Goggins. I'm a professor of electrical engineering and computer science here at the University of Missouri. With regards to the research that I do here, I have 2 programs. One is a Games for Learning program that we partner with the School of Information Science and Learning Technology on. So we employ about 8 different people directly through Department of Education grants on that program. My other program is the study of open source software. And there's an organization or project inside the Linux Foundation that I co-founded called CHAOS, which is about measuring the health and sustainability of open source software projects across a number of domains. I have 3 PhD students that are funded by that Sloan Foundation grant and other federal grants under review at the National Science Foundation. I've had that money in the past, so that's my introduction.
You didn't even come close to 5 minutes.
No, I feel like that's all they need to know to get started.
Yeah.
For me.
So my name's Erica Borman, and I'm an associate professor in medical pharmacology and physiology in the School of Medicine at Mizzou, and I'm also the director for translational biosciences research education. So I direct the master's in pharmacology and physiology and the PhD in translational biosciences. So research-wise, I have my own lab in the School of Medicine, and my research focuses on vascular dysfunction and inflammatory diseases, particularly inflammatory bowel diseases like Crohn's and ulcerative colitis. And I should say what brought me here from Michigan originally when I was a postdoc is that this is one of the best places in the world to study vascular physiology, and I would very much like to have funding to keep it that way. And then obviously, as I've acquired some more administrative roles, I spend a tremendous amount of time working with trainees and focusing on training the next generation of scientists. So those are kind of my 2 primary focuses now.
Hi, I'm John Tavis. I'm a professor of molecular virology at St. Louis University in St. Louis. I am also director of the St. Louis University Institute for Drug and Biotherapeutic Innovation, which is what happens when you let a committee name a institute. It's basically our drug discovery institute. So in that role, I promote drug discovery by the faculty at St. Louis University, and of course, by extension of the multiple students that we have. And my own personal research, I study hepatitis B virus, kills about 1 million people a year, big problem worldwide. And I'm involved in both basic science research into its replication mechanisms and drug discovery, trying to develop drugs to help improve care for the people around the world suffering from that infection.
Hi, I'm Maureen Donlin. I'm a research professor in the biochemistry department at St. Louis University, also part of the School of Medicine. I'm also director of a master's program in bioinformatics and computational biology. So we're training, the next group of computational biologists, hopefully. And I am director of the research computing group within our Office of Vice President for Research. And so my own research was focused around studying fungal diseases and developing new, hopefully, some new compounds for new therapies for fungal infections. But mostly in the last few years, I've transitioned more into support for research infrastructure. So I'm currently we have an NSF grant to build out a new high performance compute to do more sort of AI related research within St. Louis University.
Hi, I'm Carolyn Orban, and I'm a medical anthropologist and a teaching professor of health sciences. I study epidemic disease and human culture, how culture impacts the spread of disease and potentially mitigates the spread of disease. So 1918 flu is my particular area right now, although I've also worked with measles in the past. In thinking about what kind of federal funding for research has looked like, because I'm teaching faculty, I don't do a lot of looking for grants or trying to get funding. A lot of my research doesn't take much funding anyway, but I have been funded by the NSF in the past. But I also am a little bit prepared to talk about the way that other federal agencies support research, particularly of students, because I've had student interns over the 10 years I've been faculty, and I was a student intern at the Smithsonian Institution while I was an undergraduate. And so at some point, I hope we can get to thinking about student trajectories and the way that various federal agencies play a role there.
Great. I mean, since everybody was so concise, I think maybe what I'd like to do is continue with each person speaking about the most significant impacts of these reductions and threatened reductions in funding and actually concerned impacts on students, health matters, economic matters, things that reverberate throughout the community, but I'll leave it to each individual to address what you want to speak to.
And also, the audience can write questions if you have them on your cards and they'll be picked up. Please do it.
I'll go ahead and follow on with what you said about the support for students. So we had an NSF training grant for our bioinformatics program that ran for 5 years, which was a huge draw in terms of bringing students into that program. And most of them went on and they're supporting research labs. But from my own personal experience, I mean, the Department of Education, I got student loans and Pell Grants from them when I was an undergrad. I had NIH training grant funding when I was a graduate student. I had NIH postdoctoral funding when I was a postdoc. And I worry greatly about this impact that, you know, the students won't even have a chance to start. I did summer internships when I was an undergrad on an NSF funded summer undergraduate research fellow. We were SERFs at the University of Iowa. And, you know, that's the pipeline for the next generation of scientists, is those kind of experiences. And I don't know what we'll do if we can't train those and get those students excited about doing research.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I agree with everything you both said. I think most people are in agreement that as grant funding decreases, there's less money to have students in our labs to do the research. What I've noticed more now is that students are becoming dissuaded from doing the career at all because of the uncertainty. You know, if it seems like it's not going to be a stable career for them, you know, I was 4 years in college, 5 years in PhD, 5 years as a postdoc before I got my faculty position. That's a long haul if you feel like there's not going to be something there for you at the end. And it's hard to blame students if they're unsure. And certainly, you know, if there's not funding, it's hard to take somebody coming out of their college degree and say, just wait another year or 2 or 3 years until things equalize and then come back to us, because that's unlikely. I don't think I would have done that.
So Maureen and I are married, in full disclosure, and we have a son who this summer will be defending his PhD in computational mass spectrometry from the University of Tennessee, working at the Oak Ridge National Lab, obviously funded by the federal government. He's terrified. He's going to come out, again, he's 30 years old. That's how long it takes to finish your formal training. This is before he even starts postdocs. And no jobs. I mean, we're literally trying to get him to consider moving to Lyon, France, because I have a friend who runs a mass spectrometry facility there who is dying to get high quality support. So the US may lose a talented young investigator. I've got a student in my lab who just graduated in December. She's doing a short postdoc in my lab. And She wants to become a research pharmacologist. Well, she is a research pharmacologist, trying to develop new drugs to help people like us. And no jobs. Okay, just dried up. This woman has 13 publications in 5 years. Okay, she's awesome, and no jobs. Nobody's hiring.
I think that this, the effects on students, I would echo what everyone has said here, that without that pipeline, it's going to be difficult to continue the science that we're doing, because the pipeline isn't just about, well, you can't think of it like we're going to shut down the restaurant for a few months during COVID. It's more along the lines of, I'm training students, and then those students graduate and they go off and have faculty jobs or other research jobs, and they train students. So when the river dries up and there's nobody training the next generation, and I'm going to get older every day, and all of us will, there's going to be this gap where all of a sudden discovery in this country, we are right now known as probably the center of scientific discovery on the globe. And this is at risk. And it's a significant component of why the US dollar and why our economy is so strong, because we create so much. People send their best and brightest from around the world to the USA to learn how to be a researcher. And if that dries up, that's really bad.
Really bad. That's a good description of it.
And I'd just like to add that, although initially when this panel was coming together, we were talking about kind of the hard sciences, that funding for humanities risk. And so in the anthropology I do, it crosses the boundary between social science and humanities. I work extensively with library collections. My dissertation used a special collection at the Huntington Library that was funded and digitized by a National Endowment for the Humanities grant. And so if we lose those, then we lose the cross-disciplinary, transdisciplinary work that can happen that can be really enriching and fulfilling. The other thing I'd like to put a plug in for is also the impact on applied science. Before I came to do my PhD, I was a field archaeologist, and I worked in the private sector with money that was mostly coming from like BLM contract work, Bureau of Land Management, and maybe Army Corps of Engineers contract work, and National Park Service contract work. I worked directly for a park at one point. If we stop funding our environmental compliance, not only is there going to be environmental issues because of the non-compliance, but also then that's another source of really valuable job experience for people in a lot of fields, like biology, botany, anthropology, archaeology. So these things kind of have dual impacts, right? When we fund things like environmental review, which is compliance with federal law, you're giving people jobs, it's job creation, and you're also helping to train scientists. And so I think that's also, the applied sciences are also really important here.
And the archaeology is also saving our history.
Yeah, yeah.
So I've got various questions from people here and also on Zoom on the cards. Also, we've got a request from people on Zoom to speak really close into the microphones to make sure that they can hear you. So one question is, what practical implications does your research have for Missourians? And the request is to please place that in layman's terms.
I can start on that one. There's a lot of people in Missouri who are suffering from hepatitis B virus or any of the other diseases that are for which cures are being researched at St. Louis University, where we're trying to help people. That's literally our job, is to try and help people's health. And the funding goes away, the labs collapse, the research doesn't get done, the drugs don't get developed, the new therapies don't get developed. Something like 99% of all drugs on the market in the world right now, their genesis was in NIH-funded research, because NIH funds the basic science that gives you the playing field in which then drug developers then proceed forward with. So they shut down the NIH like they're talking about doing, or at least drastically reducing it. The supply of new drugs is going to dry up. Period. End of story.
I guess I can say something about mine. I mean, everything you just said broadly is absolutely true for my research and most research as well. As I said earlier, my research is focused on vascular dysfunction and inflammatory bowel disease. So what drew me into that as a vascular physiologist is, first, I think anyone who's known somebody with Crohn's or ulcerative colitis probably knows how debilitating and, you know, life-altering those diseases can be. But what pulled me into it is that that population is at extraordinarily elevated risk for cardiovascular disease, which is also the #1 killer of people worldwide. And they are at elevated risk for cardiovascular disease despite being not obese, not hypertensive, not diabetic, and not, you know, having those metabolic things we normally associate with that. So I'm trying to look at new understanding of why some of these inflammatory diseases can cause cardiovascular disease on the other side. And so I think you have a lot of people on the basic science side trying to bridge these disciplines. And then ultimately, you know, you can kind of pass the ball down the line to whether it's pharmaceutical industry or medical professionals to do more translational work and obviously, hopefully, ultimately drug development to, in my case, decrease inflammation and restore blood flow and quality of life for an IBD population and therefore cardiovascular disease population.
In my case, understanding the health and sustainability of open source software has a direct impact on the Zoom caller, since there's dozens to hundreds of open source software projects supporting all of the things in the wire that gets your Zoom call here. And understanding whether those projects will live or die is very important. It's very important to the companies like Zoom that operate them. And it's also an opportunity for undergraduates at the University of Missouri to develop practical job skills. Every student that's worked with me in my lab as an undergraduate has gone on to a fantastic career. Some of them, ironically, as digital fellows for the federal government, haha. You know, others working for major corporations. So I think these are the effects. And I think I'd also like speak a little bit of all of us up here. When we get grants, there's this thing called indirect that you've probably heard in the news. That probably pays for some of our neighbors' jobs. That probably helps sustain the community of Columbia, Missouri and the state of Missouri. It's not just the nerdy faculty-ish people up here that are affected. Oh, you're taking my lab away. It's not that. It's the effects on the larger community, on all of us, for losing those kinds of supports.
Explaining, I want to speak up really quickly here before they speak. Explaining it, indirects. Indirects are just part of federal grants. Because there are different rules for spending money for different aspects of what's necessary to support the grant. The federal government has divided each grant into 2 pools of money. One pool of money is called the directs, which if I receive the grant as the director, I control where that funding goes to salaries, to supplies, to equipment, things like that. The other is the essential things like power, the water bill, the secretaries who keep, fill out these reams and reams and reams and reams of federal paperwork. They have to be paid too, okay? But the rules on how the money is spent on the directs and the indirects are different. So it's an accounting tool. That's all it is. It's part of the same grant. It's an accounting tool that allows the federal government a better chance of keeping track that the money is being spent the way it's supposed to be spent. It's just an accounting tool. And the way it's been portrayed as some sort of rating of the federal treasury is just obscene, to tell you the truth.
Yeah, I agree with that. And one more thing I would like to say about that is the nature of indirect costs, that it goes to the university and then they use it to pay for maintenance, IT, environmental health and safety, and all the biological controls for the laboratory, the grant staff that help me write and submit my grants. Those are things that I no longer have to spend time on that I should be spending on research, and same for the other people in my lab. So it frees up a lot of time, and it also centralizes those costs. Like, I can't imagine how much it would cost for all of us to be contracting for each of those, you know, paying our light bill individually, paying for our IT individually in the labs. It's not realistic or manageable. And I think, yeah, both of you mentioned the same thing. It's a huge job creator. So I think it's $250 economic impact for every $1 of NIH grants received. And the vast majority of that goes to salaries. And that includes not just researchers, but custodians, administrative staff, facilities and maintenance people, you know, all types of jobs throughout the community. And I don't think we want to know what the impact is when you make that much economic activity disappear from a community all of a sudden. I would not like to do that experiment, but I'm guessing not great.
And from a staffing perspective, the University of Missouri is already cut down to the bone, so we'll be chopping off limbs at this point.
Yeah, I mean, somewhat connected to this, but in a broader sense, this was the question that came in, which was asking about, this has already been alluded to, but about foreseeing a brain drain to other countries. So that also gets this to a national level. I don't know, I know John spoke about this, but does anybody else want to speak to the concern about that brain drain of talent leaving the US?
I mean, I don't know of anyone at SLU yet who's packing up and moving, but I have read accounts where University of Toronto is recruiting faculty from Georgetown or something. Anyway, Canada's looking at that going, great. We can bring in some of the best and brightest in the United States back in Canada. Because they're not gonna back down. We're not gonna get them back very quickly.
My
if
guess
ever.
is we would lose more at the trainee level.
Yeah.
People will just decide to go do their PhDs elsewhere and then they'll get trained there and never leave.
Yeah,
And be wonderful assets to those countries.
yeah, half the members of my lab were not born in the United States. And it's a massively international project research. It's actually one of the biggest side benefits of being a university researcher is you get to know people from around the world very well. And they're just people, a little bit different flavor every now and then, but they're just people. And they're just wonderful to interact with. So, and I am worried particularly about one of my employees, because this person happens to be Muslim, okay, and she's on a visa. Okay, it's an H visa, but yeah, I'm worried.
There was a question, this is a very important question, I'm sure it's on a lot of people's minds, which is, what can ordinary Missourians do to help? Anybody want to tackle that?
Call your congressmen, senators. I know it feels like you're shouting into the winds and if you're lucky, you talk to the staffer. But it does make a difference. And if enough people call and enough people who aren't necessarily like, if I call and say I'm part of the research enterprise, well, yeah. But if you call and say, I am concerned, if you're gonna cut like USDA funding, who's gonna address the fact that the bee colonies are collapsing? Or our crops need to be more drought resistant? I mean, that's bread and butter for Missouri. And these are issues that need to be addressed at a federal level. So yeah, write to your congressman and representatives.
Yeah, and just talk about it with other people in your communities. So I live in Marshall, Missouri, which is a pretty rural community, and I'll tell anyone who will listen to me. Like, oh, hey, this is what indirect costs are. It's not stealing money away from my research. The amount I said I needed for research is the amount I get for research. And, this is what these other things are. So you can be that mouthpiece to kind of clear up some of those confusions just amongst the public, in addition to communicating with local, national, any politicians.
I would like to add that maybe doing a self-inventory of how your life intersects with federal work. I know when I was sitting down thinking about what I would say here, I went through all the different agencies that I've had some contact with as a student over the course of my student career and then my professional career. And it was, I don't know, 10 or 12 different agencies. And if you like genealogy, well, being concerned about the fate of the Library of Congress. If you like to go to museums and art shows, maybe thinking about funding for the arts and how that will be impacted. Look around you and pay attention to those notices of what is getting federal funding and think about what would happen if that disappeared. Because I think part of maybe what's allowed this to happen is the invisibility of those services in our life. We don't understand where they're coming from. And so if we do the best we can to make them more visible to ourselves, we can advocate for those things that we are concerned with and that we have investments in.
And in terms of basic science, it's hard to look at any one basic project and say, this is where this is going to go in the future. But it's extremely easy to look at something right now and look back. So, 1 in 8 adults right now is on a GLP-1 medication. Those were developed with basic science research. I lost my father to graft versus host disease after a bone marrow transplant. less than 10 years later, there was a drug for that. And like, that doesn't happen in that particular scenario anymore. So it's harder to look right now at any one person's research projects. I understand in the public, sometimes you look at grant titles and it seems so niche and so specific that it's hard to say like, should we really be paying our taxpayer money? But I would challenge people in the public to look at some of our big breakthroughs and go back in time and see those little projects and how they led us to where we are now.
Anybody like eggs? Okay, they raise a lot of eggs in Missouri. In fact, one of our star students from years ago who became a faculty member and was in fact just recruited to a named and endowed professorship. Okay, so this woman was really awesome. Her family were egg growers here in Missouri. Well, there's something called bird flu going on right now. Bird flu is devastating the flocks of chickens. Okay, you know who's in charge of controlling that? Federal government, the CDC. Okay. What do you do?
So I just want to make sure I pick up on some other questions that have not been touched on. Someone asked about overhead. Just to be clear, overhead was addressed with comments about indirect costs, that those are synonymous, so that people understand that.
Yeah, and I think John's description of his accounting tool is the best description of that I've ever heard. I'm going to use that.
I've got a question that's not been brought up, but I think we want to hear about it. And the question is, how has or will the limiting of sex gender studies affect research in general, and how might it impact future drug discovery? So somebody who responded.
I can start with that one. One of these mandates that came from the federal government, evil, obviously. One of those is that drug discovery and all layers of science that are using animal research has to either employ animals of both sexes or have a really, really, really good reason why you wouldn't. For example, if you're studying testicular cancer, well, obviously you're not going to be studying that in female mice, okay? But unless there's a really, really good reason, you have to study in both genders. And the reason is that men and women are different, okay? Our immune systems are different, our reproductive systems are different, our social interactions are oftentimes very different. So there's a federal mandate to do that, all right? Well, that is now in question because you can't use gender-based descriptions. And so one of the problems that we have in drug discovery is that drugs tend to initially be tested in men or older women who are past their childbearing ages for very obvious reasons that you don't want to accidentally damage a fetus in an early stage drug trial, okay? But somebody has to push to get those studies then done in women because over half of our population is female. And so if we only test in males and there are physiological differences between males and females, how are we going to know if it's going to work in a woman? How do we know if we can safely give this to a woman of childbearing age? There are federal mandates requiring that to be done that are now actually being, I suspect they're being questioned.
Okay, thank you. Here's a question in terms of the options for alternative funding. So if any NIH cuts, for example, the state of Missouri can't fill the funding gap, what are the options for other funding? I mean, do you think that private industry will be sufficient to address these gaps?
Definitely not sufficient. I mean, it's an excellent supplement and there are things, I'm in cardiovascular, so it's very common for people in my field to be applying for funding through the American Heart Association, or for me, the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation. And they provide fairly substantial awards, but it's not enough to fund the lab. You know, if I want to train graduate students, you can't use it to pay tuition, for example, while they're in training. So there's a lot of restrictions on how you can use that private money. And I should also say this budget uncertainty is not limited to the federal government. The private places are nervous too, and some of those places are taking cycles off. Like, they can just say, we're taking a cycle off, you can't apply until this budget uncertainty passes. Because, you know, the economy is having a tough time, they're funded through philanthropy. And so if they're not getting, you know, their predicted amount of money flowing in, they'll just pause those awards. And so it's not as consistent historically as NIH funding, and certainly not the same magnitude. And they don't, I mean, until recently with cuts, they don't cover much of those indirect costs that we need to run our labs.
There's too much risk at the very beginning stages of science for private equity to step in and fund it, because the likelihood of a financial payoff in terms of a company being formed is very low. But if the federal government, if NIH doesn't fund those discoveries, that pipeline for those venture capitalists disappears as well. And the implication for places like the state of Missouri are, I think, pretty significant. I grew up in Wisconsin. There are thousands of people employed in this county that I grew up in Waukesha County, working for General Electric's MRI machines. That MRI machine you get at the hospital, that was invented at the University of Wisconsin. And as part of the management of those patents, they had to build them there. And so that created thousands of jobs over decades. Same thing with Minneapolis, St. Paul, where I've lived. The first open heart surgery was performed there in the 50s. And 99% of pacemakers in the year 2000 were designed and manufactured through Minneapolis, St. Paul. The cardiovascular treatment industry has built that city up for generations. And so cutting off science is not just cutting off some esoteric stuff that you don't understand, the big words that nerds like us might use. It actually cuts off a state's entire economy at the knees.
We actually use a term for this in translational study, is that the federal government's money is used to, quote, de-risk the development process. So to get it to the point where the investors think they could possibly make money on it, and then the private sector takes over.
And speaking as somebody who researches something that really doesn't have much potential for capital development of any kind, 1918 flu, nobody thought it was actually worth funding as science even before the COVID pandemic. And then everyone was pretty interested in what I had been working on already for years. So I think that's part of the lesson here, is you never know what's going to be relevant and when you're going to need to have an expert in, for example, pandemic respiratory disease in Missouri. So I think that's a strong case for broad funding of general sciences and humanities work at a university like we have in our town.
Yeah, I don't know if you will know the answer to these questions, but this is a good question about what federal losses have already happened to date at MU or SLU. Can any of you quantify the extent of those losses for us?
SLU's lost 5 grants so far as of about 3 weeks ago, which is a far smaller impact than most institutions have suffered at this point. The speculation that I've heard is that they are going a little bit lighter on the faith-based institutions than on the secular institutions. That's just speculation. Lord knows whether or not it's true or not. But in any case, at SLU, so far, the direct impacts are only on 5 grants. There are going to be more. And lost of subsequent grants coming in. Those are, when they start slashing the budgets in the subsequent years, that's when the enormous impact is going to happen. I obviously have no idea what the state is at the zoo.
Yeah, I have no idea. I am not aware of anyone in my department who's lost a grant yet, but we don't tend to make proposals in the spaces that have been targeted those so far.
Yeah, I also can't speak directly to any specific number of grants lost. I think that some of the changes are sort of pending legal challenges. So there's a certain amount of holding pattern and waiting and seeing and trying to anticipate possible budget and funding changes. And so I can't speak on behalf of all the many, many, many grant holders at MU, but we shall see how it shakes out in the end.
It's going to be a rough year to be in charge of the strategic plan anywhere.
So there were two questions I'll try to combine and relate to the executive order. So as people are aware, one person saying that they're trying to make themselves feel better by thinking that most of Trump's actions are executive orders, which should be easy to overturn. Of course, my understanding is, yes, that can be overturned by the next president. That's the way executive orders work. So there's a question about reversing the executive orders. But also the comment that the executive action should by law have involved Congress. And a question about, do you hold any hope that the courts can reverse these losses? Additional question is, what is our timeline help? My understanding is that at least on the indirect cost side, I believe that the proposal to reduce indirect costs across the country to 15%, that is currently on hold by the courts. But there are other things that I believe, I mean, I don't know about the courts and the reductions to NIH. If people tune into the news this morning, there were massive lines of people at HHS finding out that they no longer had jobs. So I don't know if people can speak to these issues.
I mean, in terms of whether these can be reversed, I'm not a legal constitutional scholar. We don't have a functional Department of Justice, so I'm not sure where we go with that. And that's my opinion. I don't think we have a functional Department of Justice, but the loss of people having faith in the system that's going to ripple on, even if they all got reversed, say 4 months from now. We've already lost a class of students easily, and that loss of trust in the system, I don't know how large that'll be. I don't know that anyone can put a number on that.
Anyone here ever remodeled a room in their house? Taking a hammer to something and tearing it down is super easy. It's the easiest part. I can usually do a whole room in a day, and then it takes me a month and a half to put it back together with sheetrock and paint and all that tape, right? That's what they're doing right now. They're just doing the demolition part. Great, but there's no plan for what's going to be there. So there's no plan for how we're going to handle infectious diseases, but they're just tearing down the walls. There's no plan for how the USDA is going to help manage the diseases in animals. So they're just tearing down the walls. They're tearing down the walls without a plan for how to take care of these essential services that, we rely on government for, because there's no money in it, right? No private enterprise is interested in this stuff because it's not profitable, but it's super important to our continued existence.
And if you say the state will take it over, a lot of the state funding comes from the federal government.
Yeah.
And they're, so when funding gets turned off, then there's potential impacts there, as well as expertise as well. There's kind of movement between agencies and things that has happened traditionally in the past, and that may not happen in the same way.
And I think, obviously, I'm not a legal scholar or a political scientist, so I can't speak to any of the details of that question, but to the other part, I do choose to be hopeful about the outcome. And certainly as a person who's overtraining of graduate students, I try to be the CEO of optimism and say, the best thing we can do right now is try to continue to do good science and, don't quit before they make you quit. And so that's where we are now. The best thing we can do is, try to prove to them we're going to continue to do good work. And so I am hopeful, but there's no crystal ball, and we're just going to have to wait and see how it plays out. We should have had a lawyer, a legal scholar of some sort on this panel, could probably have said something more cogent.
So this is a question that I've also been thinking about a good bit. The question is, do you know if there is any concern that would tend to silence researchers or university administrators from speaking out about this issue?
Yes. That's all it needs to be. Yeah, we're terrified. Okay, yeah, yes.
Right now, it seems individual universities are being targeted because of their historical brand. Right now, they're going after Harvard. Columbia. Yeah, they've already hit Columbia. So
Just attacked Princeton today.
oh, that's why I don't read the news every day.
And then another question that people watching the news, I'm sure, are aware of. The question is concerns about the status of foreign students here. Again, I don't know if this is something people can speak to, but I'm sure some of you are aware of situations involving students who are not citizens in terms of what has happened to them, and also just concerns about their visas status.
All three of my current PhD students are here on a student visa. So yeah, I have cautioned them about leaving and entering the country. It's affected the conferences that I send them to. I won't send them out of the United States right now. And so that limits their opportunity. You know, they're lucky to be funded at this point.
Yeah, our master's program is 80% students from India, and, you know, they're, what next year's class is gonna look like, I have no idea. I don't know if they'll even get a visa. I don't know how functional the visa system will be. None of them have come up to me personally to ask about, but even if they asked, I would recommend don't leave the country until you finish the program, because I don't know that there's any guarantee you'll get back.
So I have a question that I will do my best to answer the best extent I can. The question is the president and chancellor and the curators aware of these cuts? Obviously, I'm not going to speak about SLU. I know that, yes, the President Choi at MU is well aware.
That'd be hard to miss.
Yeah. But the additional question is what are they doing? And here I really can't speak to that, but I do want to sort of put a plug in for whatever encouragement people can give. I mean, this was just alluded to. Columbia, Princeton, Harvard, individual schools are getting cuts or threats of cuts. I don't think it's possible for any one school to, you know, stick their own neck out and think it's not going to affect them. But what I do think is necessary, this is again, these are my own views here, is for the schools together collectively to take some stands the best they can, because everyone, in my view, is going to get picked off
Yeah.
sooner or later. And I mean, I don't think there's an accident in terms of the states where schools have been targeted right now, but I was reminding some people in a meeting today that we are less than 3 months into 4-year term, and asking them to think about what happens in a year or 2 years. And I mean, again, this is something that is so collective to the importance of education, which is important to the country and even the world. But I think we need to push people to be more vocal. I will say that the president of Princeton did publish a very important piece in the Atlantic, I think it was last week, and he was calling on his colleagues, his fellow university presidents across the country, to really become much more vocal about defending the integrity of universities and what they do and their benefits and their contributions to the common good. My hope is that more people will start to listen to him. There have only really been a few prominent ones that I know of. Agreed with him on that, but maybe they need to be pushed by the citizens, by groups like this. You know, it's a wonderful group, the League of Women Voters, and other concerned citizens.
Yeah, I just wanted to say one thing related to that, which is I think the public has the ability to almost have more pull. And we haven't touched on one other really important thing for Missouri, which is that, you know, most of us here are from Mizzou, which does incredible NIH funded research, but Missouri is also home to WashU, which is just barely got passed to be number 3 in grant expenditures in the nation. And so we are disproportionately affected, beneficially by NIH funding in Missouri. We are collectively hitting way above our weight in terms of the amount of grant funding and economic impact, largely because of that incredible institution down the street. And so it would be short-sighted to think that we won't be disproportionately affected negatively by those cuts.
Good. So here's a question that's about sort of process. Can grants be canceled instantaneously, or is there a process for canceling grants in the middle of a project?
Unfortunately, during Trump's first administration, they changed some of the boilerplate language that's associated with all of them that says federal grants can be terminated without warning if they no longer match the institutional priorities. So that is the authority upon which they are doing these. There are cases where appeals are being done. Some of those appeals I know have been successful, but basically I was shocked to find that out is that they can just tear up a contract willy-nilly.
Historically, there are rules and norms, and that doesn't actually happen. You have your 3 years, your 5 years, or however long it is to explore the thing that you propose to explore. And so changing these norms, it affects planning. It affects our ability to know that we can pay for the people that we're hiring.
Yeah, there's a reason when we make big changes in policy, whether people like it or not, on either side of the aisle, it's usually implemented in a way that says, starting in 1 year, 2 years, when you apply for your next round of grants, these are things that you will have to account for. There's a reason that that's the way policy is typically rolled out to avoid some of the instantaneous fallout. So that's part of what makes this situation so difficult is nothing like this has ever happened before. So it's difficult for anyone to plan, even with a ton of institutional experience.
And another thing to keep in mind is that these grants are overseen. You have an annual renewal process where you have to demonstrate that you are actually making the progress. So if a grant is just being ignored and you're not doing what you said you were going to do, they're going to pull it back anyway. So this is all that they already have the quality control and performance metrics built into the system. This is new and on top of that.
And I'll just add from my own experience, applying for grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities. You know, I will apply, let's say in April. I won't find out until December or January. If I was successful, I wouldn't be able to start the grant until maybe the following August. So when you're talking about a long-term planning process just to start the grant period. And so there's an enormous amount of planning that's involved. One question is, do scientists and university researchers in the future need to be very intentional about translating their research into stories that average citizens can understand and relate to?
It's always wise to be able to do that. We are very well aware in the research community that the funds that we are spending every day are people's tax dollars. They're part of my tax dollars too. So we try and be very good custodians of the taxpayers' dollars. And part of that is explaining why a grant with some esoteric title with funny words that most people don't even know what they are, being able to explain that to your neighbors and your friends and your family. It's always a good idea to do that.
I will say, in trying to explain things to a non-scientist is there's always a lot of hesitation when a scientist talks about their research because we don't deal in absolutes. We deal in questions that we try to answer, but even when we answer them to the degree that we publish a paper, there's always a level of uncertainty because what we are studying is almost by definition never been studied before in quite that way. And so it's very difficult for most scientists to say, absolutely, this is what's going on. And sometimes the hesitation comes across as, well, you don't really know what you're talking about because we're not out there, doing a 3-minute elevator pitch and just selling what we're doing. It's just not the way it works in our field. And so that's also an issue in terms of trying to communicate to the general public the importance of what we're doing and the meaning of what we're doing when you're always this sort of, we think it's this way or something. We're just, yeah, it's it goes against everything you've been taught to be, you know, to say with absolute certainty, this is the way it is, because nothing will bring you down faster than figuring out that your pet hypothesis that you're sure you proved, someone came along with a better approach or a different approach, and nope, it was wrong, and you have to deal with that, so.
I do think it would be good if any research scientist could go to somebody on the street and in a non-technical way, say, this is my big question.
Yeah.
Like, we don't have to get into everything I'm doing, but like, this is where I'm trying to go. And maybe like, this is basically my roadmap. So I think that should certainly be a goal of any researcher, or probably anybody in any field, really. Explain to somebody what you do and why you're doing it.
Yeah, we're not, when we don't communicate with certainty, it's not that we don't know, it's that we have these people who we write papers and they get reviewed, and the standard is just so high to express something with certainty that we get used to not saying things that way. To Maureen's point.
This is a card that has not a question, but a statement or something to let people know about, which is that schools in the Big Ten are trying to organize on Blue Sky. Possibly there are other organizations like this. If you can share that with people if you like. I see something being written down now. Please give more questions. If you like, while I'm waiting for the next question, I could let, if there are topics especially that have not been addressed that you think are important for our audience to hear, is there something else you want to share that's not been brought up that would be valuable?
I just want to make the point that what we're talking about here today is universities and research, and of course, being in a university town, that's a very topical thing to do. But this extends all the way through all aspects of the federal government's functioning. So for example, if you go to get some gasoline, you'll see this little sticker, okay? Either the state or the federal government has certified that those weights are accurate. Well, the certifications that they go against come from a federal organization called NIST. They just fired an enormous fraction of NIST's employees. So even something as simple as guaranteeing that your scale in the store is going to give you a pound of bacon or whatever you're buying, that's going to be coming at risk.
Yeah, along those lines is every time you go in the store and you buy anything that's, you know, any kind of food, there's inspections that happen. And, you know, without CDC, without FDA, without USDA, how do we know when the next Listeria or the next E. coli outbreak happens? Who's going to track it? Who's going to monitor it? Who's going to communicate it? I understand the CDC's, Freedom of Information Act office was just shut down today. You know, I don't know what to say to that.
I worked food services in undergrad at the University of Wisconsin, and food poisoning is very scary.
People died from food poisoning.
Well, and then one of the things that's already happened is disruptions to teaching, in that, especially in the field I teach in, we rely on federal databases for, you know, assigning students work. Oh, go learn how to use this database, generate a report, learn some professional skills that will get you hired as a future health professional who's interested in community health or public health or whatever it may be. But if you go and your whole entire class logs in and the site is down because the government's decided to take it online or off of line, or all the data has changed because they're changing the data categories that can be reported, it is really disruptive to the work that we do. And it takes time from the other kinds of things we might want to do, which might be writing someone a letter of recommendation or calling a friend at a federal agency who maybe now no longer works there. So, you know, see if they have any summer internships. So these are I mean, part of the grant making, I was thinking about this, also is developing relationships between scientists, because the grant writing may happen at a university, but it's often reviewed at panels or cooperative groups of people at multiple different agencies or organizations or facilities or whatnot, universities, sometimes also international. So it's also developing networks of collaboration. It in itself is advancing science. So the very fact that all of this process is stalled means that those relationships aren't being made either. And so I think it really is disruptive, quite disruptive to people at every level of science.
Good. Are there any more questions coming in? Are there any more things that the panelists either, or any questions from Zoom participants either? Okay. Any more comments that the panelists would like to share with us?
Thank you to the League of Women's Voters.
Can you take a comment? A comment from,
Okay,
but no, it won't.
They won't know, so if you write it down, or somebody needs to sort of speak on it.
This is a rhetoric question,
We can repeat.
doesn't need an answer. I don't want to be Cassandra, but what Trump and his cronies are doing does not remind you that of a cultural revolution? Do you remember Mao, what he did? Is this the beginning, what these cronies and Trump are doing?
So the point is that this is the beginning of a cultural revolution, or it
And this
carries
is a
those
rhetoric question.
markers in the comment from the audience. I look around and make your own decisions about that. I mean,
In 4
certainly,
years, we know that.
well, I can share a story. I was in Amsterdam last week with a group of, there's like 12 to 14 countries, open source software teams. So the people that work for these different, like the Netherlands, and Belgium, and Ireland, work in the open source program offices that manage open source software in their governments. And I was there during the Signal escapade talking about security, so that was very uncomfortable. And the comment that was made to me by the colleagues are, we have seen this before in our history. This is a playbook. This playbook has been executed before. And so, where I still have good personal relationships with these folks, but they're very concerned about the United States right now. They're feeling like we were trustworthy 1 minute and now we're not. I mean, these are just people who work in open source software in these governments. And it's just an anecdote, not my opinion.
I get similar comments multiple times a week from my good friends all around the world. Again, as I remarked earlier, one of the treats of the job that I have is developing friends of all cultures and races and religions around the world. And the number of emails that I've gotten expressing concern and dismay is very large.
I have a colleague who we're running a conference together and emailed me because she left Serbia during the civil protests there. She feels like she's seeing the same things.
One thing I would just like to say in regard to this, slightly more positive note, is one of the things that you heard from the people today is just how important all of this funding is for the common good. Right? We are not talking about funding that is primarily or exclusively designed for some individuals, profit or career advancement, but we are talking about something that is really for the good of everyone. This is in health and economic terms as well, and intellectual ones. And I just think that more and more of us need to really value and promote as best we can that idea of the common good, because that is something I think that's very much worth holding on to. And I think that is at the foundation of much of what science really is, and just the advancement of learning that the universities represent in their best way. So that's just something I just wanted to throw in there, that it connects to so many things people can say.
I agree with that. And I think that just speaks to the nature of kind of the collateral damage of these broad strokes policies. So regardless of where anyone is politically, even if you do say, we're putting too much money towards, certain rich institutions doing all this research, we want to cut them off. And we're going to do that by cutting off indirects because Ivy League schools have the highest indirect, percentages. That's maybe what the original thought is, but if what you want to do is punish, let's say I'm a faculty member at Columbia University, I'm paid out of direct costs my salary is paid out of direct costs. So that indirect policy is not going to necessarily target the person you intended to target. It's going to hurt the custodians, the maintenance people, the IT staff, the environmental health and safety staff. And so I think for the public, just being aware of, even if you are not really a huge proponent of biomedical research, and if you don't like some of these big private institutions, like, is this actually doing the thing that you want it to do? Even if you don't like it, just to think about those. And, I think for the public to challenge you to have that conversation with people who might have opposing viewpoints.
I don't know what the protocol is for wrapping up.
Thank you all for coming out.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You.
Sure.
Thank
you so much,
Go left, go left.
Go left.
Yeah, so we can see you on the.
So I'll see you.
Go left.
I'll just share a moment. Marie had to leave, so she asked me to kind of announce a few things that are coming up. I just want to thank you so much. This was so excellent and a warning to us all. It doesn't matter how rich you are. I keep saying this, you still have to breathe the air, drink the water, eat the food, fight the diseases. And so we are so grateful for the work that the government does and for what you do. So thank you so much. And thank you so much for about the common good. That's what it's about. As to voting, this is, primary thing. So there is an election on April 8th. You can vote in advance if you didn't know that. You can actually, during the week, you can go to the Boone County, if you're in Boone County, obviously, to vote. Yeah, Boone County Government Center. And it's really easy. I went on Saturday and I was number one and voted, took 2 minutes and I was out of there. So very important always to contact your legislators. Let them hear from you. Even if you think they're not listening, call. It doesn't take you a couple minutes. The other day I called Congressman. I spoke actually to someone. I was surprised. I thought I'd go to voicemail. So I delivered my concern. So just do it because they need to hear from us. So the first thing was April 8th is the actual election day. April 9th, the League has a monthly program called Lunch and Learn, which is held right here in the library at noon. And the speaker this month will be former Judge Gary Oxenhandler talking about the judicial system. So that would be very interesting. The other thing that the League has been involved in locally, and this is historic, is a person who was very well known here in Columbia, Luella St. Clair Moss, who was the president of what at the time was Christian College. She was quite a remarkable woman. She actually ran for Congress in 1922 when women had just barely gotten the vote. So she's just an amazing woman. So the League has been really interested in promoting her, wanted a school named for her. But what's going to happen this month, April 13th, there's going to be an event where they're going to talk about Luella over at Columbia College from 2 to 4 p.m., which is a fundraiser. And then there is a play that's just been written, which is going to be presented by Greenhouse Theater on April 17th to 19th, also at Columbia College. And that we hope you would enjoy. That's a little light program. We kind of need that.
Yeah.
But thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you for doing a great job.